firing and a gunshot. Each has a certain tone. They're very similar, but definitely not the same, and they need to understand this difference. Though admittedly, it's hard to get the youngest one to understand, for he's only 3. "Let's practice," the man says. "You hear gunshots? What do? The other children grab the 3-year-old and drop to the floor before crawling inside of a bathtub and huddling inside. A sadness washes over him, but he buries it for his children's sake and then tells them to go get ready for supper. The children do as they're told, leaving the man alone with his thoughts. His name is Medgar Evers, a man forced to prepare his children for harsh realities. And in this case, the reality is, one night, he will be murdered. Thanks so much to Ting Mobile for supporting our discussions of important historical stories. The story of Medgar Evers is sometimes overshadowed by other martyred civil rights activists of that era, like
Meet a digital bank account built for businesses like yours. With American Express Business Checking, you'll save
like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and El Haj Malik Shabazz, more often known as Malcolm X. This is for a couple of reasons. First, that his work was mostly limited to the state of Mississippi, and second, because he was assassinated much earlier in his career as an activist. But the impact of Medgar Evers remains profound, as his untimely death proved to be a powerful catalyst for change. Evers was born in Decatur, Mississippi in the summer of 1925, the middle child of 5. And you know that cliche of an old man telling his grandkids about walking some ridiculous distance to school? Well, that was the reality for the Evers kids. Every day, they'd walk 12 miles just to get to their segregated, overcrowded, underfunded schools. And like many African Americans of the time, Medgar decided the best method to make a way for himself was to join the army, which he did in 1943. He entered combat during the Normandy landings, a few weeks shy of his 19th birthday, when his logistics unit was tasked with supplying combat troops inland. Part of the famed Red Ball Express, a convoy system of supply trucks with mostly African American drivers. Evers drove trucks 350 to 400 miles from the Normandy coast in order to supply General Patton's Third Army. After Medgar was honorably discharged, he went on to college and met his sweetheart, Merle Beasley. They married before graduation, eventually had 3 children, and settled in Mound Bayou, Mississippi. Once his family's roots were planted, Medgar built a practical career as an insurance salesman, but still, a greater destiny called to him. In 1952, he and his older brother Charles became interested in the anti-colonial Mau Mau uprising against British rule in Kenya. They read about and tracked the developing story each day, a fact that some historians credit with the shaping of Evers' worldview. Reportedly, he'd made correlations between the treatment of Kenyans by the British and his own experiences in Mississippi. Shortly afterward, Evers got involved with civil rights work, joining the Regional Council of Negro Leadership and organizing a boycott against gas stations that wouldn't allow black patrons to use their restrooms. Then in 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated public schools were unconstitutional, he decided to test the law by applying to the state-run University of Mississippi Law School. And though openly rejected because of his race, his audacious action raised enough of a ruckus to gain the attention of the leading civil rights organization in the country, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. The NAACP appointed Medgar to the office of Field Secretary for Mississippi with a mission to cause similar good trouble. In this capacity, he staged multiple boycotts against racist public figures and their businesses. He led protests that forced several schools, and even the Mississippi State Fair, to integrate. And he was bravely vocal about the murders of black political figures in his community, such as civil rights leaders G.W. Lee and Lamar Smith, who each organized voter registration drives, and Emmett Till, a 14-year-old lynched by a white mob after being falsely accused of flirting with a white woman. For the next 9 years, Evers' popularity in the black community flourished, but he also made powerful enemies entrenched in Mississippi's racist power structure, and he knew it. Which is why he began to prepare Merle, Darrell, Rena, and little James as best he could for the most horrible night of their lives. Medgar drove home the night of June 11th after meeting with his lawyers. Now, normally, he had an FBI protection detail, but for an unknown reason, they didn't accompany him that night. He pulled into his driveway 15 minutes after midnight. In a dark irony, Merle and the kids had only hours ago watched President Kennedy deliver his famous civil rights report, where he appealed to America's better angels, urging the public to improve their treatment of African Americans. But in the case of at least one Mississippian, the president's plea had fallen on deaf ears. The bullet came from a high-powered Enfield rifle, fired by a man concealed across the street. Medgar never saw his killer. He was shot in the back, the bullet piercing his heart. Hearing the gunshot, Murley screamed for her children to run and hide. Then she ran to the front door, where she would find her husband in a pool of blood. The children initially did do what they had been told, but curiosity and worry got the better of them, and it wasn't long before they too were in front of the house crying, cradling their father, as he lost consciousness. Neighbors came out to help, and eventually they carted Medgar to a nearby hospital that tried to refuse him because he was black. He would die within the hour. A week later, he was buried in Arlington Cemetery with full military honors, with 3,000 people in attendance. Multiple protest marches followed his death, including one attended by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and another that led to over 140 arrests, despite the fact the march was nonviolent. Police found the rifle used to kill Evers across the street, and the registered owner, Byron de la Beckwith, not long after. Like Medgar, Beckwith was a man who belonged to various organizations. Only his were the White Citizens Council and the Ku Klux Klan. Beckwith was one of many whites angry at Medgar for his work desegregating schools. And while the police picked up Beckwith on June 21st, what followed was nothing short of a farce. Klansmen who had served on the Jackson police force fabricated alibis for Beckwith, who was also maintaining that the rifle had been stolen from his house days prior to the murder. And since voting and citizenship suppression was still strong in Mississippi, no blacks could serve as jurors. So, Murley Evers was forced to sit through 2 separate trials and watch as all-white male juries let Beckwith go. Adding insult to injury, Mississippi Governor Ross Burnett actually came into the courtroom, shook Beckwith's hand, and sat down with him while Murley was on the witness stand. When he was acquitted the second time, the white community in Jackson threw Beckwith a parade. Murley Evers couldn't take it anymore, so she packed up her traumatized children and left Mississippi. First to California, then to Oregon, but she never gave up in pursuing justice for Medgar. 30 years later, when a new judge was assigned to the county, she went back and arranged a meeting with the district attorney. There she met Assistant District Attorney Robert DeLauder, who, after looking into some of the details, became almost as obsessed with the case as she was. And in January of 1994, Beckwith was finally convicted by a jury comprised of 8 blacks and 4 whites. He was said to be equally surprised by the verdict, as he was the life sentence. And after getting away with murder for 30 years, he would die in prison 6 years later. And when they publicly announced the verdict, Murley stood in front of the courthouse with microphones in her face and tears in her eyes. She simply looked to the sky and said, "We did it, Medgar. We did it."
We were there in Paris. Exclusive events and incredible restaurants. Nights at the Sapphire Lounge on the Seine. Heaven.
Experience the world as an insider. From exclusive lounges to immersive dining experiences, all at Chase Sapphire Reserve.
Murley would go on to work with the NAACP and other organizations and remains a champion of equality and the American promise to this day. In fact, during Obama's second inauguration in 2013, she became the first woman and first non-clergy member to deliver a prayer at an American presidential inauguration. There, she invoked her late husband and other slain black leaders when she said, "They are a great cloud of witnesses unseen by the naked eye, but all around us, thankful that their living was not in vain." One can only hope that as the years roll on, we can preserve the legacy of men like Medgar Evers and all those that died for freedom, not just on the battlefields of foreign wars, but for the struggle of freedom right here at home. Once again, thanks so much to Ting Mobile for believing that important stories like the one you just heard should be told loud and clear. As we mentioned the last time we talked about Ting, our cell phone bills as of late were, let's just say, a bit much. Which is why I was excited to learn about Ting, which runs on the same nationwide LTE and 5G networks as my old provider, while cutting my phone bill nearly in half.